Jake Lawson wiped the rain from his weathered face, squinting against the howling wind that whipped across his small wooden dock. For 40 years, he had called this slice of coastline home, his modest fishing operation barely visible from the main harbor, just the way he liked it. The weather forecast had promised clear skies, but Jake knew better than to trust predictions over instinct. The way the gulls had fallen silent hours earlier, the strange heaviness in the air, nature had been whispering warnings all day. Now, those whispers had become a deafening roar. Massive waves crashed against the pilings, sending spray 20 feet into the air. The dock groaned beneath his feet, wooden boards shuddering with each assault from the angry sea. Jake's boat, the Mary Lynn, named after the wife he'd lost years ago, strained against her moorings, bucking violently as if begging to break free. "Just hold on, old girl," Jake muttered, securing another line. His hands, calloused from decades of hauling nets, moved with practiced precision despite the trembling dock. The rain turned sideways, stinging his face like tiny needles. Lightning split the black sky, illuminating the churning waters for brief, terrifying moments. No sane person would be out in this. The harbor patrol had issued warnings hours ago, all vessels to seek immediate shelter. That's when he heard it, crackling through the static of his ancient radio inside the small shack at the end of the dock. A distress call, broken and desperate. Taking. On water, coordinates, please, anyone. Jake froze, rain streaming down his neck. He stared out at the violent waters, visibility near zero. The transmission came again, weaker this time, a woman's voice fighting to be heard above the storm's fury. He grabbed his binoculars, scanning the horizon frantically. Nothing but darkness and angry waves. The Coast Guard station was 20 miles north. Unlikely to hear this transmission on such a local frequency. Even if they did, help would take precious time to arrive. Jake glanced at the Mary Lynn, his faithful companion through countless storms. She wasn't built for rescue operations, just a humble fishing vessel that had kept him fed all these years. But she was sturdy, resilient, like the woman she was named for. His radio crackled again, this time with just 3 desperate words. "Please, anyone, help." Lightning flashed again, and for just a fraction of a second, Jake thought he caught a glimpse of something, the faintest silhouette against the black horizon. A vessel being swallowed by monstrous waves. Without hesitation, Jake grabbed his emergency kit and slicker. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was suicide. One old man in an aging fishing boat against a storm that could swallow them both without a trace. But 40 years on these waters had taught Jake Lawson one unbreakable rule. You never turn your back on someone in trouble, not when you might be their only hope. The dock creaked beneath his determined steps as he made his way to the Mary Lynn, his decision already made. Sometimes, the most dangerous waters revealed a person's true character. Tonight, the storm would meet its match. Dawn broke reluctantly over the battered coastline, pale fingers of light crawling across a sea that had spent itself in violence. Jake Lawson stood at the edge of his damaged dock, surveying what remained of his small fishing operation. Splintered, wood, torn nets, equipment scattered. The storm had extracted its toll. His eyes burned from a sleepless night. The distress call had haunted him through the darkest hours, the voice silenced when his radio finally surrendered to the water that flooded his shack. The Coast Guard had been unreachable, the storm severing all communication. Jake had been forced to wait, helplessness settling in his chest like an anchor. Now, as the mist began to lift, he scanned the horizon with his old binoculars. The sea was still restless, waves breaking against the jagged rocks that had claimed countless vessels. Over the decades, these waters didn't forgive mistakes. They consumed them. That's when he saw it, a shape where no shape should be. Near the treacherous outcropping, locals called Widow's Teeth, a small vessel listed severely, its hull torn open like a wound. It was a miracle the boat hadn't been dashed completely against the rocks during the night. Instead, it hung suspended in a precarious dance between destruction and survival, each wave threatening to deliver the final blow. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The boat wasn't local. Its design unfamiliar, sleek lines suggesting something built for speed rather than fishing. Even from this distance, he could see the damage was catastrophic. The craft couldn't stay afloat much longer. Then, movement. A figure appeared on the tilting deck, waving frantically. Jake watched, transfixed, as the person struggled to maintain balance on the dying vessel. One wrong step, and they'd be swept into waters still cold enough to kill within minutes. The rational decision would be to call for help. His radio was destroyed, but he could drive to town, alert the authorities. They had the proper equipment, trained personnel. But Jake knew the cruel mathematics of time. How quickly hypothermia could set in, how suddenly a damaged boat could surrender to the sea. He glanced at the Mary Lynn. She'd weathered the storm better than his dock. Sturdy old vessel that she was. Her engine might complain, but she would answer his call. The figure on the distant boat was more frantic now, something desperate in their movements. Jake couldn't make out details, man or woman, young or old, just a solitary soul trapped between the hungry sea and unforgiving stone. Without another moment's hesitation, Jake grabbed his emergency kit and a coil of rope. His joints protested, reminders of his 67 years, but his hands remained steady. He'd navigated these waters since he was a boy, knew every current and hidden danger like he knew his own reflection. The mysterious vessel was sinking by inches. The lone figure continued signaling, something almost frantic in their movements. Now. Jake's weathered face set with determination as he started the Mary Lynn's engine. Some might call it foolish, an old fisherman risking everything for a stranger. But out here, where the sea showed no favoritism, there was an unwritten code that transcended all else. You never turned away from someone in peril. The Mary Lynn cut through the still agitated waters, her bow rising and falling against stubborn waves that refused to fully surrender after the storm's rage. Jake Lawson's weathered hands gripped the wheel with practiced steadiness, his eyes never leaving the tilting vessel ahead. Each second that passed was another the mysterious boat might slip beneath the surface. Navigating around Widow's Teeth required intimate knowledge of these waters. The jagged rocks barely concealed beneath the churning surface had claimed vessels, far more substantial than Jake's fishing boat. One wrong calculation, one moment of hesitation, and the rescue mission would require a rescue itself. "Hold on," Jake muttered, unsure if he was speaking to the stranger or to himself. As he drew closer, details emerged through the lingering mist. The vessel was indeed unusual, sleek and built for speed rather than hauling catches. Its white hull was now marred by a vicious gash along the starboard side, water pouring in faster than any pump could expel it. The boat had minutes left, not hours. The figure on deck was a man, tall but hunched over in what Jake recognized immediately as pain. One arm hung awkwardly at his side. His face was streaked with blood from a gash across his forehead, yet his eyes remained intensely alert, scanning Jake's approach with calculated precision. "I'm going to come alongside," Jake shouted above the waves and engines. "Can you jump?" The man nodded once, his jaw clenched tight. There was something in his stance, even injured, a certain readiness, a coiled tension that spoke of training. Beyond civilian life, Jake maneuvered the Mary Lynn as close as he dared, the two vessels dancing dangerously in the swells. The timing would need to be perfect, too early or too late, and the man would hit water instead of deck. "Now!" Jake called as the boats momentarily aligned. The stranger moved with surprising agility despite his injuries, launching himself across the gap in one fluid motion. He landed hard on the Mary Lynn's deck, a grunt of pain escaping through clenched teeth as his injured arm took some of the impact. Jake immediately steered away from the sinking vessel, not a moment too soon. As they pulled away, the mysterious boat gave a final shudder before the sea claimed it completely, disappearing beneath the surface with barely a sound, as if it had never existed at all. "Thank you," the man said, his voice steady despite the pain evident in his eyes. "I didn't think anyone would reach me in time." "Jake Lawson," Jake offered, extending a hand after setting course for his dock. "Mark Reeves," the stranger replied, his grip firm despite his evident weakness. "Former Marine," Jake nodded, noticing now the military bearing that even injury couldn't diminish. The way Mark scanned his surroundings, assessed exits and entrances, habits that remained long after uniforms were shed. "That's quite a wound," Jake said, gesturing to Mark's head. "First aid kits below deck. Let's get you patched up before we reach shore." Mark's eyes held Jake's for a long moment, something unreadable passing through them, relief mixed with what might have been wariness. "I appreciate the rescue," Mark said carefully, "but I should warn you, helping me might be more complicated than you think." The Mary Lynn pushed steadily toward home, leaving behind only churning waters where Mark's vessel had been. Whatever complications the former Marine brought with him, Jake Lawson had already made his choice when he'd first spotted that sinking boat. The journey back to shore seemed to stretch endlessly, the Mary Lynn fighting against waves that still carried the storm's memory. Jake had bandaged Mark's head wound as best he could, using the weathered first aid kit he kept below deck. The gash was deep but clean. It would need proper stitches, but it would hold for now. Mark sat silently on the small bench, his military posture never fully relaxing despite his exhaustion. His eyes constantly scanned the horizon, watching the coastline approach with an intensity that spoke of something beyond mere relief at being rescued. "Coast Guard will have questions," Jake offered, breaking the silence. "Boat like that going down, they'll want to know what happened." Mark's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'd rather avoid official channels, if possible." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Jake had spent decades on these waters, encountered all types: fishermen, smugglers, and tourists, thrill-seekers. He knew when someone was running from something or towards something even more dangerous. "Not my business what you were doing out there," Jake said finally, guiding the boat toward his damaged dock. "But these waters don't forgive mistakes. Whatever had you out in that storm must have been mighty important." Mark's eyes met Jake's, measuring, calculating. A decision formed behind them. "It was," he said simply. Nothing more. The dock appeared, more battered in full daylight, planks missing, pylons exposed. Jake tied up carefully, helping Mark disembark with his injured arm. The former Marine moved with the careful precision of someone managing significant pain while refusing to acknowledge it. "My cabin's just up that path," Jake said, nodding toward the modest structure nestled among wind-bent pines. "Not much, but it's dry. You can rest there while I head into town for supplies." Mark hesitated, something vulnerable briefly crossing his face, the first crack in his disciplined exterior. "I've put you at enough risk already." "Risk?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "Only risk around here is Mrs. Henderson's coffee at the general store. Stuff could strip paint." The joke fell flat against the weight of whatever Mark carried. The former, Marine's eyes darted to the tree line, the road, back to the water, cataloguing approaches, exits, threats. Inside the cabin, Jake offered dry clothes that hung loose on Mark's taller frame. The single room was sparse but tidy, a lifetime at sea teaching efficiency in small spaces. Jake busied himself building a fire in the small stove, while Mark eased himself onto the worn couch, fatigue finally overwhelming even military discipline. "I'll head into town," Jake said, pulling on his jacket. "Get some real medical supplies, maybe something stronger than coffee." Mark's eyes were already growing heavy, the combination of pain, exhaustion, and finally being somewhere secure taking its toll. Jake paused at the door, watching as the stranger fought to stay alert. "Thank you," Mark murmured, his voice slurring slightly as consciousness began slipping away. "I owe you more than you know." As Jake quietly closed the door behind him, those final words echoed in his mind. Whatever storm had brought Mark Reeves to his doorstep, Jake suspected it wasn't finished yet. Some storms, he knew, followed you to shore. Jake Lawson jolted awake in his weathered armchair, the fishing magazine slipping from his lap. He'd returned from town last night with supplies, only to find Mark sleeping deeply, fever setting in from his wounds. Jake had settled in to keep watch, eventually drifting off himself as dawn approached. Now the morning sun streamed through salt-crusted windows, but it wasn't daylight that had awakened him. It was the distinct, powerful rumble of military-grade engines. Nothing like the familiar puttering of local fishing boats. Mark was already on his feet, pain visibly pushed aside as he peered cautiously through the window. His entire body had transformed from wounded stranger to alert sentinel in seconds. "They found me," he whispered, more to himself than to Jake. Outside, the quiet harbor that had known only fishing vessels and occasional pleasure craft for decades was now dominated by an imposing presence. A sleek Navy patrol vessel, its gray hull gleaming in the morning light, had anchored just offshore, close enough to make its purpose clear while avoiding the harbor's more shallow waters. "Friends of yours?" Jake asked, moving beside Mark at the window. Mark's expression hardened. "Depends on who's commanding." Before Jake could press further, movement caught his eye. A smaller boat had deployed from the vessel, cutting efficiently through the calm morning waters directly toward his battered dock. Even from this distance, the precision of its approach spoke of intensive training. "You should leave," Mark said suddenly, turning to Jake. "They're not here for you. No reason for you to get involved." Jake straightened his back, years falling away as dignity replaced weariness. "This is my property, my dock, and you're my guest." The simple declaration carried the weight of a lifetime spent standing his ground. Through the window, they watched as the small craft reached the dock. 6 figures disembarked, 5 in crisp naval uniforms, flanking one in particular, whose bearing marked him clearly as their leader. A commander, judging by the insignia visible even from the cabin. The officers moved with practiced coordination, securing the area with subtle hand signals. Their eyes scanned the property, lingering on the cabin where Jake and Mark stood watching. "Captain Lawrence," Mark murmured, recognition and something like relief in his voice. At least they sent someone who knows. Jake turned to Mark, questions forming, but the former Marine was already moving toward the door, squaring his shoulders despite his injuries. "Wait," Jake called. "What exactly am I walking into here?" Mark paused, hand on the doorknob. For the first time since his rescue, a hint of a smile touched his face. "Remember I said I owed you more than you know?" Mark's eyes held a new intensity. "That boat you found me in? It wasn't just any vessel. And what I was carrying..." He glanced toward the naval officers now approaching the cabin's worn path. "Well, let's just say it's the kind of thing nations go to war over." Jake's weathered face revealed nothing, but his mind raced. In all his decades on these waters, he'd never imagined his small fishing dock would become the stage for whatever was unfolding now. The sharp, authoritative knock that came at the door seemed to echo with finality. Whatever storm had brought Mark Reeves to his doorstep had finally arrived in full force. Jake Lawson opened his cabin door slowly, decades of ocean weather having taught him that facing storms head-on was sometimes the only way through them. Before him stood 6 naval officers, their uniforms pristine against the backdrop of his weather-beaten property. The one in front, tall with silver at his temples and eyes that carried the weight of significant authority, stepped forward. His insignia gleamed in the morning sun, marking him clearly as someone accustomed to giving orders rather than taking them. "Mr. Lawson." The question wasn't really a question at all. but a confirmation of information already known. Jake nodded, once his weathered face revealing nothing. Behind him, Mark stood silently, his military bearing returned despite his injuries. "Captain James Lawrence, United States Navy," the officer continued, his voice carrying the precise cadence of someone who measured his words carefully. "I understand you rescued a man from a sinking vessel yesterday during the storm. It wasn't a request for information, but an acknowledgement of facts already confirmed." Jake's eyes narrowed slightly. How had they known? No radio calls had gone out, no distress signals sent. The sinking boat had disappeared without witnesses, or so he had thought. "News travels fast for a remote fishing dock," Jake observed. Maintaining his position in the doorway, Captain Lawrence's expression remained unchanged. "Mr. Lawson, the man you rescued and the vessel he was piloting are matters of national security. I need to speak with Mark Reeves immediately." The direct mention of Mark's name confirmed what Jake had already suspected. This was no random search. They knew exactly who they were looking for, exactly where to find him, and exactly what had happened. Jake glanced back at Mark, whose face revealed nothing to the untrained eye. But Jake had spent a lifetime reading the ocean's subtle signs. He recognized the tension beneath the calm. "And why would the Navy send a captain and 5 officers to my door for one man?" Jake asked, his voice steady. "Seems like a lot of firepower for a simple rescue follow-up." Something shifted in Captain Lawrence's gaze, perhaps respect, perhaps caution, because what Mark was transporting is of vital importance to national security, he replied, lowering his voice slightly. "And because Mark Reeves isn't just any former Marine." Jake turned fully to Mark now, questions evident in his expression. The man he'd pulled from a sinking boat, bandaged and sheltered. Who was he really? Mark stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Jake in the doorway. "Captain Lawrence and I worked together in naval intelligence," Mark explained, quietly. "Before I officially retired." The pieces began falling into place in Jake's mind. The unusual boat, Mark's hypervigilance, his reluctance to involve authorities. Not a smuggler then, but something far more complicated. "The storm wasn't an accident, was it?" Jake asked, understanding dawning. "Someone wanted that boat sunk, wanted you at the bottom of the ocean." Captain Lawrence's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Lawson, I appreciate your assistance in this matter, but what happens next is classified at the highest levels. I'm going to have to ask you to—" "He stays," Mark interrupted firmly. "Whatever happens next, he's earned the right to know. If it weren't for Jake Lawson, both I and what I was carrying would be lost." The captain's eyes moved between the two men, calculating, assessing. The other officers remained vigilant, hands never far from their sidearms. "Very well," Captain Lawrence said finally. "But Mr. Lawson, what you're about to learn can never leave this room." Jake stepped aside, allowing the officers to enter his small cabin. In all his years on these waters, he'd never imagined his modest fishing dock would become entangled in matters of national security. But then again, the deepest currents were always the ones you couldn't see from the surface. Captain Lawrence's eyes widened slightly as Mark stepped forward from the shadows of Jake's cabin, straightening his posture despite his obvious pain. With practiced precision, Mark raised his uninjured arm in a perfect military salute. "Lieutenant Colonel Mark Harrison, sir," he stated, his voice transformed. "No longer the grateful survivor, but a decorated officer reporting for duty." The naval officers behind Captain Lawrence immediately stiffened, several returning the salute instinctively. Jake stood frozen, the name echoing in his mind. Mark Reeves was a fiction. The man he'd pulled from churning waters was someone else entirely. "At ease, Colonel," Captain Lawrence responded, his tone shifting from commanding to respectful. "Damn. Good to see you alive." Jake's weathered hands gripped the back of a nearby chair, steadying himself as the revelation washed over him. "Lieutenant Colonel, significantly higher ranking than the retired Marine he'd claimed to be. The pieces were rearranging themselves, forming a picture far more complex than a simple rescue. "I apologize for the deception, Jake," Mark, or rather Colonel Harrison, said, turning to face the fisherman who had saved his life. "Operational security required it." Captain Lawrence stepped forward, addressing Jake directly. "Mr. Lawson, the man you rescued is Lieutenant Colonel Mark Harrison, one of the most decorated Marines in special operations. His service record includes 3 Silver Stars and interventions in conflicts most Americans never hear about." Jake's eyes met Harrison's, searching for traces of the injured man he'd pulled from the sinking vessel. They were the same eyes, but now filled with the unmistakable weight of command and the burden of classified operations. "And that boat?" Jake asked, finding his voice at last. Captain Lawrence exchanged glances with Colonel Harrison, who nodded once. "Permission granted, Colonel." Harrison was transporting sensitive intelligence materials, the captain explained, choosing his words carefully. "Intelligence that could prevent a significant threat to national security." Harrison winced slightly as he shifted position, his injuries demanding attention despite his disciplined control. "The storm wasn't the only thing that damaged my vessel. Jake, we believe hostile forces tracked me after extraction. The mission parameters were compromised." One of the naval officers produced a small device, scanning the cabin methodically. Another positioned himself at the window, vigilant eyes surveying the perimeter. The casual rescue had transformed into something resembling a military operation. "So, that's why you were alone," Jake said, understanding dawning. "No backup, no support team." Harrison nodded grimly. "Deep cover extraction, solo protocol. If I'd been captured with what I was carrying..." He left the sentence unfinished, the implications hanging heavy in the room. Captain Lawrence stepped closer, his voice lowered. "Mr. Lawson, what Colonel Harrison recovered was time-sensitive intelligence that could prevent an imminent attack on American soil. When his tracking beacon went dark during the storm, we feared the worst." Jake's gaze drifted to the bandaged wound on Harrison's head, the makeshift sling supporting his injured arm. Temporary measures applied by weathered hands, more accustomed to mending fishing nets than tending to wounded special operators. "The intelligence materials," Harrison said, his voice urgent despite his controlled demeanor. "They were sealed in a watertight case. When the boat began taking fire, I secured it to..." "The underwater compartment," Jake finished, remembering how Harrison had kept glancing toward the water where his vessel had sunk. "It's still down there." The cabin fell silent as realization spread across every face. The mission wasn't over. What Lieutenant Colonel Mark Harrison had risked his life to protect still lay beneath the waves, in the shadow of the jagged rocks that had claimed his vessel. And time was running out. Colonel Harrison moved to the center of Jake's modest cabin, his presence somehow making the small space feel even smaller. The naval officers parted respectfully, a subtle acknowledgement of his authority despite his civilian clothes and bandaged wounds. "Jake," Harrison began, his voice softer than before, "you didn't just pull some stranded boater from the water yesterday." He paused, searching for words that could bridge the gap between the classified world he inhabited and the straightforward life of the fisherman before him. "You interrupted an enemy operation, one that had been months in the planning." Captain Lawrence nodded grimly. "The storm provided perfect cover. Our intelligence suggests they planned to intercept Colonel Harrison's vessel, capture him, and retrieve what he was carrying. Instead," Harrison continued, "they found only debris, and you," he gestured to Jake with his good arm, "you appeared out of nowhere, a variable they couldn't have planned for." Jake stood silently, processing the revelation that his simple act of rescue had unknowingly disrupted something far larger and more dangerous than he could have imagined. The quiet fishing dock he'd called home for decades had become the stage for international espionage and counter-terrorism operations. The intelligence materials Colonel Harrison secured contained details of a planned attack, Captain Lawrence explained. Names, dates, locations, the kind of intelligence that prevents headlines from ever being written because the threat is neutralized before it materializes. One of the junior officers stepped forward, addressing Jake directly for the first time. "Sir, what you did." He hesitated, clearly measuring his words against security protocols. "Well, there are families who will never know how close they came to tragedy, all because you launched your boat when no one else would." Jake shifted uncomfortably under the weight of their gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same," he said simply. "No," Harrison countered firmly. "They wouldn't have. I've operated in 37 countries, Mr. Lawson. Human nature is predictable. Most people run from danger, not toward it." Captain Lawrence checked his watch, exchanging glances with his team. "We need to move quickly. The recovery operation for the intelligence materials needs to begin immediately." The officers began preparing to depart, their brief moment of acknowledgement giving way to the urgency of their mission. Jake watched as they transformed before his eyes from visitors, in his home to operators, with a critical objective. Before joining them, Harrison turned to Jake one final time. The military bearing softened briefly, revealing the man beneath the rank and classified operations. "I meant what I said last night," Harrison said quietly, his eyes meeting Jake's directly. "I owe you more than you know. You didn't just save a man yesterday. You preserved intelligence that will save lives, American lives." He extended his hand, the gesture oddly formal in the aftermath of their shared ordeal. "I owe you, Jake Lawson, and I always pay my debts." Jake took the offered hand, his weathered palm against Harrison's calloused grip. Different lives that had intersected by chance, or perhaps something more. "Just doing what needed doing," he replied simply. As the group prepared to depart, Captain Lawrence paused at the door. "Mr. Lawson, this will all remain classified. No public recognition, no acknowledgement. That's the nature of this work." Jake nodded, understanding. Glory had never been his motivation. Not in 40 years of fishing these waters, not in rescuing a stranger from a storm-tossed sea. Harrison was the last to leave, pausing one final time at the threshold. "The intelligence community has a saying, Mr. Lawson," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "The most important operations are the ones the public never hears about." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Remember that when you're back on your dock, watching the sunrise." As they departed toward the waiting naval vessel, Jake Lawson stood in his doorway, the morning sun warming his weathered face. The waters beyond his damaged dock appeared calm now, giving no indication of the secrets they held or the storm they had weathered. Some debts he knew could never truly be repaid, and some heroes, like the fishermen who launched their boats into storms, asked for no payment at all. "Mr. Lawson," Captain Lawrence said, pausing halfway down the path to the dock, "we could use your expertise." Jake stood frozen in his doorway, the words taking a moment to register. The naval officers had already begun loading into their craft, equipment being transferred with military precision. "My expertise," Jake echoed, confusion evident in his weathered face. Captain Lawrence turned fully now, his posture straight as the mast of a well-maintained vessel. "You know these waters better than anyone. The currents around those rocks, the seabed formations, knowledge that could be invaluable in our recovery operation." Jake's eyes drifted to the jagged outcropping where Colonel Harrison's vessel had met its fate. The widow's teeth had claimed dozens of boats over the decades. He'd spent a lifetime learning their secrets, the hidden currents that swirled beneath their deceptively calm surface. "With all due respect, Captain," Jake replied. Cautiously, "you've got sophisticated equipment, trained divers. What could an old fisherman possibly offer that your team doesn't already have?" Colonel Harrison stepped forward, wincing slightly as his injured arm shifted in its makeshift sling. "Time, Jake. You offer us time." His voice dropped lower. Every hour that case remains underwater is another hour our enemies might locate it first. Jake's gaze moved between the two military men, then past them to the imposing naval vessel anchored offshore. Its grey hull seemed oddly out of place against the simple beauty of the fishing harbor he'd called home for decades. "I've never set foot on a Navy ship," Jake said, more to himself than to them. Harrison's expression softened momentarily. "Consider it payment for the rescue, a tour few civilians ever receive." There was something else in the colonel's eyes, an unspoken urgency that transcended the already serious nature of their mission. Jake had spent a lifetime reading subtle signs, weather patterns, water conditions, the behavior of fish beneath the surface. He recognized when something remained unsaid. "There's more to this, isn't there?" Jake asked quietly. "Something you're not telling me." Captain Lawrence exchanged glances with Harrison, a silent communication passing between them. "The intelligence. Materials aren't the only thing down there," Harrison admitted finally. "There's equipment, classified technology that cannot fall into enemy hands. Under any circumstances, the implication hung heavy in the salt-tinged air. This wasn't just a recovery mission. It was a race against unseen adversaries who might already be mobilizing their own recovery efforts. Jake turned back to his cabin, briefly grabbing his weathered jacket and the worn captain's hat that had seen him through countless voyages. Some decisions required no deliberation at all. "I'll need my charts," he said simply. Minutes later, Jake found himself aboard the naval craft, cutting through familiar waters as a visitor rather than their master. Colonel Harrison sat beside him, eyes scanning the horizon with professional vigilance despite his injuries. "You didn't have to agree," Harrison said quietly as they approached the larger vessel. Jake watched as his small dock receded in the distance, the modest cabin growing smaller against the coastal landscape. For 40 years, his world had been defined by that stretch of shoreline, by the rhythms of tides and seasons. "Some things you do because they need doing," Jake replied, echoing the simple philosophy that had guided his entire life. As they approached the naval vessel, its immense hull looming above them, Jake felt the disorienting sensation of a man stepping far beyond the boundaries of his familiar world. Equipment he couldn't identify gleamed on the deck. Uniformed personnel moved with purposeful efficiency. Nothing about this resembled the quiet life he'd built for himself. "What exactly did I get myself into?" he murmured, the question carried away by the ocean breeze before anyone could offer an answer he might not want to hear. Jake Lawson stood in the command center of the naval vessel, surrounded by technology that made his boat's simple sonar system look like a child's toy. Screens displayed underwater topography with crystal clarity, mapping the jagged formations of widow's teeth in three-dimensional detail. Officers moved with practiced efficiency, their communications crisp and precise. He felt impossibly out of place in his weathered fishing clothes, a lifetime at sea suddenly seeming small against the backdrop of military precision. Yet when Colonel Harrison entered, followed by Captain Lawrence, all eyes turned to Jake with unmistakable respect. "Mr. Lawson," Captain Lawrence began, gesturing toward a digital display of the underwater terrain. "Before we brief you on the recovery operation, there are things you need to understand about what you've become involved in." Colonel Harrison nodded to an officer who secured the door. The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly, conversations dropping to silence as classification protocols took effect. "What I'm about to share is classified at the highest levels," Harrison said, his voice steady despite his injuries. 3 months ago, intelligence identified a sophisticated smuggling operation using our coastline. "Not drugs," he added, seeing Jake's expression. "Something far more dangerous." Captain Lawrence tapped a command, bringing up images on the main screen. Satellite photographs of unmarked vessels, thermal imaging of underwater exchanges, surveillance photos of individuals whose faces had been deliberately blurred. Weapons-grade materials, he explained grimly. Components that in the wrong hands could be assembled into devices capable of devastating casualties. Jake's hands gripped the edge of the tactical table, steadying himself as the magnitude of what he'd stumbled into became clear. My mission, Harrison continued, was deep cover infiltration, posing as a corrupt former military officer willing to sell expertise and access. I spent 10 weeks embedded with their network, gathering intelligence on supply chains, contacts, delivery methods. And it worked, Captain Lawrence added. Too well. Colonel Harrison identified not just the smuggling operation, but its connection to a planned domestic attack. The intelligence he secured contains names, dates, locations, everything needed to dismantle the entire network. Jake looked between the two men, understanding dawning. So that boat wasn't just transport. It was your extraction. Harrison's expression darkened. They discovered my true identity 12 hours before extraction. The storm provided cover for my escape, but they were ready. The damage to my vessel wasn't just from the rocks. It was hit with something, likely a portable missile system, before taking on water. We lost communication with Colonel Harrison during the storm, Captain Lawrence explained. His tracking beacon went dark. We had search teams out all night, but in those conditions... He left the sentence unfinished, the impossible odds hanging in the air. Then a fishing boat appeared out of nowhere, Harrison said, his eyes meeting Jake's. While specialized teams with advanced equipment couldn't reach me, a single fisherman in a vessel named after his late wife managed what they couldn't. The room had fallen completely silent, every eye now on Jake. The intelligence materials are sealed in a specialized case, Captain Lawrence explained. Waterproof, damage-resistant, but it's been underwater for nearly 24 hours now. The locator beacon is operating intermittently, likely damaged in the attack. Harrison stepped closer to Jake, his military bearing momentarily giving way to genuine emotion. You didn't just save a drowning man, Jake. You interrupted an operation that's been years in planning, preserved intelligence that will prevent American civilians from dying on their own soil. Jake absorbed their words in silence, his weathered face revealing nothing. Beyond the vessel's reinforced windows, he could see the outcropping of widow's teeth, familiar terrain now transformed by the knowledge of what lay beneath its surface. Those rocks have always kept their secrets, he said finally, turning back to the tactical display. But they've never kept anything from me. Captain Lawrence spread a detailed nautical chart across the tactical table, his finger tracing the jagged outline of widow's teeth. Despite the vessel's advanced technology, the officers gathered around the paper map with the reverence mariners had shown such documents for centuries. Our recovery operation faces significant challenges, the captain explained, his voice measured but urgent. The underwater currents around these formations are unpredictable. The seabed drops off suddenly here. He indicated a spot just beyond. The rocks, creating a trench that could carry the case beyond our search parameters if we don't act quickly. Jake studied the chart silently. The Navy's version was precise, technically accurate, yet it missed subtle truths only experience could teach. Places where seasonal currents created invisible pathways. Underwater formations that changed with winter storms and spring tides. Knowledge embedded in his bones after 4 decades on these waters. Your charts are wrong, Jake said simply, reaching across to indicate several points. The depth here is greater than marked, and this formation collapsed during last winter's nor'easter. There's a new channel cutting through, redirecting the current eastward. The officers exchanged glances, reassessing their operational plans in light of this information. Colonel Harrison stepped forward, his injured arm still in its makeshift sling, determination evident despite his physical state. Jake, Harrison said, his voice losing some of its military formality, we need your help, not just your knowledge, but you, on site, guiding our divers through the recovery operation. The request hung in the air, its significance unmistakable. This wasn't just consultation, it was active participation in a classified military operation. "I'm not military," Jake replied, stating the obvious. "I'm a fisherman, have been my whole life." Captain Lawrence nodded respectfully. "That's precisely why we need you. Our divers are the best in the world, but they don't know these waters, like you do. Minutes could make the difference between success and failure." Jake turned toward the observation window, looking out at the familiar coastline that had framed his entire existence. Somewhere beyond that window was his small dock, his modest cabin, the simple life he had built for himself. A life of predictable rhythms and quiet purpose. "What exactly are you asking?" Jake said finally, turning back to face them. "Join the recovery team," Harrison answered directly. "Guide our divers to the most likely location based on your knowledge of the currents. Help us secure that case before anyone else does." The unspoken implications were clear. This wasn't a request made lightly, nor one without risk. Whatever enemies had targeted Harrison's vessel might still be searching these waters. "You have fancy equipment, trained personnel," Jake said, gesturing around the command center. "Why risk bringing a civilian into something this sensitive?" Harrison exchanged glances with Captain Lawrence before answering. "Because sometimes experience trumps technology, because you've already proven you can navigate conditions that kept our teams at bay." Jake's weathered hands traced the coastline on the chart, following contours so familiar he could have drawn them from memory. His fingers paused over Widow's Teeth, the place where Harrison's vessel had disappeared beneath the waves. "If I say no," he asked quietly, "then we thank you for the information you've already provided, return you to shore, and proceed with our operation." Captain Lawrence replied without hesitation. "This is a request, Mr. Lawson, not an order." In the silence that followed, Jake felt the weight of the decision before him. Return to the quiet life he'd known for decades, or step into something larger, something that carried both purpose and danger in equal measure. Beyond the vessel's reinforced windows, the morning sun illuminated his familiar waters, somehow changed by what he now knew lay beneath their surface. The preparation moved with military precision, dive equipment being loaded onto the smaller deployment vessel as officers reviewed the operation timeline. Jake Lawson stood at the railing, watching the choreographed efficiency with the quiet assessment of a man who had spent decades working alone on the water. Something caught his eye, a flash of movement where there shouldn't be one. Jake squinted against the morning sun, his weathered hand shading his eyes as he scanned the horizon. There, just beyond the harbor entrance, a fishing vessel idled. Nothing remarkable about it at first glance. White hull, modest wheelhouse, the kind that frequented these waters daily, except Jake knew every boat in this harbor, had known them for years. This one was unfamiliar. Then he spotted another, positioned at the far edge of the bay, similar in appearance, but too far from shore for typical fishing operations. Its deck appeared empty, but its position was perfect for monitoring the harbor mouth. "Colonel!" Jake called, his voice low but urgent. "We've got company." Harrison was at his side in seconds, eyes following Jake's subtle gesture toward the distant vessels. His posture changed imperceptibly, the shift from wounded man to combat-ready operator happening in the space of a heartbeat. "How long have they been there?" Harrison asked, his voice casual, while his eyes methodically catalogued positions and angles. "Wasn't there when we boarded," Jake replied. "Appeared within the last 10 minutes. That one," he nodded toward the closer vessel, "is positioned where it shouldn't be. No one anchors there, the bottom's too rocky." Harrison signaled to Captain Lawrence, who joined them with unhurried purpose. Nothing in his demeanor betraying concern as tactical information was exchanged in low tones. "They're watching the operation," Harrison concluded. "Same group that targeted my extraction. They know the case is here somewhere." Captain Lawrence's jaw tightened. "We need to accelerate the timeline, get the divers in the water before the..." communications officer appeared suddenly at the captain's side, interrupting with practiced urgency. "Sir, we're receiving a distress call. Pleasure craft reporting engine failure, approximately 2 miles east of our position." Jake's eyes narrowed, decades of maritime instinct sounding silent alarms. East would put them just beyond the outer marker. Convenient timing. Harrison was already moving toward the tactical display, pulling up coordinates with his good arm. "Any other vessels responding to the distress call?" "Negative, sir," the communications officer replied. "We're the only vessel in range." Captain Lawrence studied the nautical chart, measuring distances and angles with experienced eyes. "Maritime, protocol requires we respond to vessels in distress." "It's a trap," Jake said quietly, certainty in his voice. "Anyone having engine trouble there would drift with the current toward Fisher's Point, not away from it. They're trying to draw your vessel out of position." Harrison nodded grimly. "Splitting our resources. While we respond to the distress call, they move in to recover the case." The tactical implications unfolded like a spreading stain. The naval vessel couldn't ignore a distress call without raising suspicion, yet responding would potentially compromise the recovery operation. Jake watched the officers exchange glances, the weight of command evident in their expressions. "They're not just smugglers," Harrison said finally, confirming what Jake had already begun to suspect. "They're former military, specialized training, the kind who know exactly how to manipulate maritime protocols." Captain Lawrence turned to his communications officer. "Maintain radio contact with the distressed vessel. Inform them we're preparing to render assistance." As orders were issued and the crew mobilized, Jake felt the subtle shift beneath his feet, not just the motion of the vessel, but the feeling of stepping into currents far more dangerous than any he'd navigated before. Jake Lawson stood at the tactical display, his weathered finger tracing a route invisible on the Navy's sophisticated charts. Captain Lawrence and his officers gathered around, their skepticism fading as Jake outlined his plan with the quiet confidence of a man who had navigated these waters through hurricane and fog. "There's a channel here," Jake explained, indicating an area where the Navy charts showed only impassable shallows. "Formed during the storm of '97, runs beneath the surface, hidden by the reef outcropping. Too narrow for large vessels, but your tactical boats could navigate it easily." Colonel Harrison leaned forward, studying the route. "And this channel would allow us to circle behind them," Jake finished, his eyes meeting Harrison's. "While your main vessel appears to respond to the distress call, your tactical team can use this hidden route to flank the suspicious boats. They'd never see you coming." Captain Lawrence exchanged glances with his tactical officer, measuring the risk against potential reward. "The depth would give us barely 3 feet of clearance." 3 feet is an ocean if you know where to steer," Jake replied simply. Minutes later, Jake found himself aboard a tactical vessel with 6 Navy specials operators, their equipment sleek and lethal. He sat beside the pilot, providing guidance as they slipped away from the main ship and disappeared into what appeared to be an impenetrable line of rocky shallows. "Hard to port here," Jake instructed as they approached a section where jagged stones broke the surface. "Then full throttle through the gap. The current will do half the work for you." The pilot followed his directions with precise movements, doubt giving way to respect as the hidden channel revealed itself. The tactical boat sliced through water that seemed impossible to navigate, spray cascading over the bow as they accelerated. Through the narrow passage, 15 degrees starboard, Jake called, spotting the subtle change in watercolor that marked the channel's curve. "Maintain speed until my mark." Behind them, the Navy vessel made a show of preparing to assist the distressed boat, positioning itself exactly where the smugglers wanted it, seemingly distracted and vulnerable. The tactical display showed the suspicious fishing vessels beginning to move, converging slowly toward Widow's Teeth, where Harrison's sunken boat and its precious cargo lay hidden. "Cut engines in 3, 2, 1. Jake commanded. The tactical boat glided silently into a natural cove formed by overlapping rock formations, completely hidden from the harbor but offering perfect visibility of the approaching vessels. "They're sending divers," one of the operators whispered, handing Jake a pair of binoculars. Through the powerful lenses, he could see figures on the deck of the nearest suspicious vessel preparing underwater equipment. Harrison's voice came, through their communications, calm and measured. "Tactical team, you are clear to engage. Primary objective is capture, not elimination. We need to know who they're working with." Jake watched in silent awe as the Navy team transformed before his eyes, movements synchronized with practiced precision as they prepared for engagement. The tactical boat slipped from its hiding place, accelerating silently toward the first target vessel, whose crew remained focused on their diving preparations, utterly unaware of the approaching threat. What followed was a masterclass in coordinated naval operations. The special operators boarded the first vessel with such speed that resistance was minimal. Simultaneously, the Navy ship used Jake's intelligence to position a second team to intercept the other suspicious boat. "Second vessel attempting to flee," came the urgent communication. "They'll head for the eastern channel," Jake said immediately into the comm system. "It's the only deep water escape route, but there's a sandbar shift from last month's storm. If your team positions at these coordinates," he quickly provided numbers committed to memory years ago, "they'll have no choice but to surrender or run aground." Captain Lawrence's voice responded immediately. "Eastern intercept team, adjust. Course to Lawson's coordinates." Minutes later, the confirmation came through. Both vessels secured, crews in custody, operation complete without casualties. As Jake stood on the deck of the returned tactical boat, Colonel Harrison approached, respect evident in his gaze. "In 30 years of operations," Harrison said quietly, "I've never seen anyone navigate like that." Jake shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "When you've spent a lifetime on these waters, you learn to read what others can't see." The sun hung low over the harbor as Jake Lawson's weathered boots touched the familiar planks of his dock once more. Behind him, the Navy vessel remained anchored offshore, its imposing silhouette softened by the golden light of approaching evening. The operation had concluded hours ago. The intelligence case recovered, the smugglers in custody, the threat neutralized with an efficiency that spoke of professional excellence. Jake paused, looking back at the path he'd traveled since that stormy night. In less than 48 hours, his quiet existence had intersected with matters of national security, submarine channels he'd navigated for decades, suddenly revealing their strategic value beyond fish and tides. Captain Lawrence approached, his uniform pristine despite the day's activities. Beside him walked Colonel Harrison, his arm properly bandaged now, his posture strong despite his injuries. Behind them followed a small contingent of officers, their formation deliberate and respectful. "Mr. Lawson," Captain Lawrence began, his voice carrying the weight of official capacity. "Before we depart, I wanted to personally express our gratitude for your assistance today." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "Just did what needed doing," he replied, the same simple philosophy that had guided his entire life. "What you did," Harrison interjected, "was provide expertise that technology couldn't replicate. Your knowledge of those hidden channels saved lives and secured intelligence vital to national security." Captain Lawrence nodded in agreement. "The operation would have proceeded very differently without your guidance. Those smugglers would have likely recovered the case while we were distracted with their false distress call." One of the officers stepped forward, presenting a small wooden box to the captain, who accepted it with a nod before turning back to Jake. "While the nature of this operation prevents any public recognition," Captain Lawrence explained, opening the box to reveal an official-looking document, "I'd like to present you with this honorary commendation from the United States Navy." Jake stared at the document, its official seal gleaming in the evening light. His name was inscribed in formal calligraphy, though the details of his service remained purposefully vague, classified information hidden behind carefully chosen language. "This doesn't happen often," Harrison added quietly. "Civilian commendations at this level require approval from the highest echelons." Before Jake could respond, Harrison reached into his pocket and withdrew a small metal object. He held it out in his palm, a coin heavy and ornate, its surface embossed with insignia Jake didn't recognize. "This is my personal challenge coin," Harrison explained. "In military tradition, these are given to recognize special achievements or to honor someone who's proven themselves in extraordinary circumstances." Jake accepted the coin hesitantly, feeling its substantial weight in his palm. The metal was cool against his skin, engraved with symbols and dates meaningful to those who shared the brotherhood of service. "Only those who've earned it carry these," Harrison continued, his voice lower now. "When you enter any military bar around the world and someone conducts a coin check, you can produce this. Every service member there will buy you a drink, no questions asked." Captain Lawrence smiled slightly, "though the details of how you earned it will remain classified." Jake studied the coin, turning it in his calloused fingers. A tangible connection to a world so different from his own, yet one he had briefly inhabited with unexpected effectiveness. "I don't know what to say," Jake admitted finally. Harrison's expression softened, the military bearing giving way momentarily to the man Jake had pulled from churning waters. "You don't need to say anything. The coin speaks for you." As the officers prepared to depart, Captain Lawrence extended his hand. "Mr. Lawson, it has been an honor to work with you." Jake accepted the handshake, the simple gesture bridging the gap between his world of tides and catches and their world of classified operations and national security. The coin remained in his pocket, a weight both physical and symbolic, a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary acts come from the most ordinary lives. Jake Lawson sat on the edge of his rebuilt dock, legs dangling above waters now calm and innocent. 3 weeks had passed since the Navy vessel had disappeared over the horizon, taking with it the classified operation, the captured smugglers, and the evidence of how a simple fisherman had briefly become essential to national security. The morning sun warmed his weathered face as he sipped coffee from a chipped mug that had survived decades of use. His dock had been completely repaired, mysteriously and overnight, by a construction crew that arrived without warning and departed without explanation. The materials were far superior to what Jake could have afforded himself. He reached into his pocket, fingers finding the challenge coin that had rarely left his person since that day. Its weight had become familiar, a constant reminder that the most ordinary life could intersect with the extraordinary when circumstances demanded it. The past 3 weeks had unfolded in stark contrast to the 48 hours that had changed. Everything. Jake had returned to his fishing routines, checked his traps, mended nets, all the familiar rhythms that had defined his existence for decades. Yet something fundamental had shifted within him, like a current changing course beneath an apparently unchanged surface. Purpose. That was the difference. For years, Jake had lived simply because living was what one did, moving through days defined by tides and weather, seasons and catches. Now, each sunrise carried new significance. His intimate knowledge of these waters, accumulated through decades of quiet observation, had proven valuable beyond measure when it mattered most. The Navy officers had departed with assurances of confidentiality, their operation classified at levels Jake could barely comprehend, yet he understood the importance of silence. Some stories weren't meant for the sharing. A sound caught his attention, the distinctive approach of a boat engine, different from the local fishing vessels. Jake shaded his eyes, scanning the horizon until he spotted it, a sleek civilian, craft approaching his dock with practiced precision. As it drew closer, Jake recognized the tall figure at the helm, no longer injured, but standing with the unmistakable posture of military bearing. Colonel Mark Harrison, or whatever his real name might be, navigating directly toward the small dock where their unlikely alliance had begun. Jake felt a smile creasing his weathered face. The challenge coin grew warm in his pocket as he stood to welcome his visitor. Perhaps some storms didn't just pass through a life, they redirected its course entirely, and sometimes promises made in moments of danger were the ones most faithfully kept.